Come with me. 3 words. No explanation, no condition, no hesitation. Spoken on a sidewalk on a cold November morning in Columbus, Ohio, by a man who had his own grief to carry, his own silence to live inside, his own reasons to keep walking. He almost did. Keep walking, that is. There was a young woman sitting at the broken end of a bus stop bench on Carver Street. She'd sat on the broken end because she couldn't see it was broken. Her white mobility cane rested against her knee. Her canvas bag sat between her feet, packed with the careful precision of someone who knew exactly how little they had and was determined to make it look like enough. Her jacket was thin, far too thin for 29-degree November air. She had been sitting there since before the sun came up. Her name was Cara. She was 20 years old. She had lost her grandmother 6 weeks earlier, been quietly pushed out of the only place she had left to go, spent 2 nights in a shelter, and ended up on that bench in that cold after boarding the wrong bus in a city she barely knew. The man who found her was Aaron Briggs, 34 years old, single father. A man who had spent 2 years learning to carry a grief of his own, quietly, steadily, inside a routine that kept their lives upright but couldn't quite make the apartment warm. He almost walked past her. He didn't. And the words he said when he turned around, 3 words, simple and direct, became the beginning of something none of them had planned. Not Aaron, not Cara, and certainly not a 7-year-old girl named Nadia who would open a door that Sunday and say something to a blind stranger that neither of them would ever forget. Stay with me. You're going to want to be here for every single moment of this. Aaron Briggs moved through mornings the way a man moves through a house he knows by heart, automatically, efficiently, without having to think about any of it. Up at 5:50, coffee by 6:05, Nadia's lunch packed and in the yellow lunchbox by 6:20, Nadia herself fed, dressed, and walked to the school bus by 6:45. Then the 11-minute walk to Carver Street for the 7:22, same route every single morning, coffee going cold in his hand before he was halfway there. He didn't dislike the routine. He had built it deliberately, constructed it piece by piece in the months after Renee died, because routine was the only architecture keeping their lives upright. Without it, there would have been nothing but open space, and open space in those early months had been its own kind of danger. So he kept the routine. He kept it the way you keep a thing that isn't beautiful, but is necessary. But inside the routine, inside the packed lunches and the school runs and the carefully maintained schedule, there was a silence he had never quite figured out how to fill. The apartment was functional. It was organized. It was clean. It just wasn't warm in the way a place becomes warm when someone who loves you is inside it. He noticed that more than he let himself admit. He turned onto Carver Street at 7:14 and saw her immediately. She was sitting at the far end of the bench, the broken end, the side that tilted slightly downward at an angle, the wood cracked clean through and patched with old tape that had long since stopped holding anything together. She had settled onto it carefully, weight distributed the way you distributed when you've learned through years of navigating a world you cannot see to test surfaces before trusting them. Her white mobility cane rested against her knee. Her canvas bag sat between her feet, upright, precisely placed, the way you place something you need to be able to find again without looking. Her jacket was thin, September weight, light fabric, no lining, a zipper that stopped at the collar and left her neck exposed to the open air. 29 degrees. She was shivering, but slowly. The slow, deep, accepted shiver of a body that had been cold for so long it had stopped registering the cold as an emergency and simply incorporated it as the new condition of existing. Her eyes were open, unfocused, fixed on a distance that didn't exist. Aaron stood on the sidewalk and looked at her, and something inside him went very quiet. The 722 was already visible at the far end of the block, making its slow approach, right on schedule. He had a meeting at 8:15. He had forms due before 9. He told himself she was probably fine. He told himself someone else would stop. Then he looked at the jacket again. 29 degrees. He stopped walking. "Excuse me," he said softly, keeping his voice low so he wouldn't startle her. "Are you waiting for the 722? She turned toward his voice immediately, the precise, practiced movement of someone who had long learned to locate the world through sound rather than sight. Her head tilted just slightly, orienting toward him with a focus that felt more complete than most people manage with their eyes wide open. "Is that the one going to the transit center?" No, that's the 740. This one goes downtown. Something crossed her face, a flicker of exhaustion she controlled almost instantly, pulled back behind a careful composure that she wore, the way some people wear armor, not hard, just held together, deliberately. I think I'm at the wrong stop, she said. Her voice was steady, trained to steadiness. How long have you been out here? Aaron asked. A pause, a beat too long, a while. He would understand later that a while had meant since before 5 a.m. The 722 arrived at the stop. The doors opened, a handful of people boarded, the doors closed. Aaron didn't move. He called his supervisor from the sidewalk, said he'd be late, then he slid his phone back into his pocket and looked at the young woman on the bench, at the jacket, at the careful composure, at the white cane, at the canvas bag packed like someone who knew exactly how little they had. There's a diner 2 blocks from here. It's warm. Will you come with me? She was quiet for just a moment. The kind of quiet that isn't hesitation so much as assessment, reading a voice, reading an intention, making the calculation that people who cannot see learn to make very quickly and very accurately. You missed your bus, she said. Yeah, Aaron said. I did. Another pause. Okay, she said quietly. She found the edge of the bench with her hand, stood with a steadiness that suggested she had long since stopped waiting for people to offer help she hadn't asked for, adjusted the bag on her shoulder, and held her cane out in front of her. I'm Aaron, he said. Cara, she said. 2 blocks north, he said. I'll walk beside you on the left. She nodded once, and they walked. Marcy's diner had been on that corner long enough to become part of the neighborhood's memory. The sign in the window read "Open" in red neon that flickered slightly on the left side. Inside it was warm, deeply, immediately warm, and the warmth hit you before the door had fully swung shut behind you. The waitress, Pat, had worked there long enough to recognize when someone needed to be fed without being asked whether they were hungry. She took one look at Cara and brought 2 plates without asking what they wanted. She poured coffee, refilled Aaron's before he'd finished half of it, and said nothing else. Just warmth. Just that. Cara sat across from Aaron with her hands wrapped carefully around the mug and her composure held in place. She was polite. She answered questions in the exact amounts required and offered nothing extra. She said she was fine. She said she would figure it out. She said she didn't want to be a problem for anyone. Aaron picked up his fork, set it down again. Then he said, simply and directly, "What actually happened to you?" Not, "Are you okay?" a question she'd have deflected without effort. Not, "Is there someone I can call?" a question that would have gone nowhere. Just, what actually happened to you? Something in the plainness of it reached her in a way that careful sympathy hadn't. It wasn't pity. It wasn't performance. It was a genuine question from a person who genuinely wanted to know the answer. She looked down at her coffee mug, and then she told him. Her grandmother's name was Loretta. She had raised Cara from the age of 8 in a small rented house in Dayton, after it became clear that Cara's parents couldn't do it themselves. Her father had been gone since she was 6. Not dead, just absent, which Cara had come to understand was sometimes worse than dead, because at least dead gave you something solid to grieve. Her mother carried her own battles that left very little room for a child. And eventually the courts agreed that Loretta's house was where Cara needed to be. It was the right decision. It was, looking back, the best thing that had ever happened to her. Loretta was not a large or dramatic woman. She was practical and steady and quietly, completely devoted. She never treated Cara's blindness, which came on gradually at 14, a degenerative retinal condition that arrived without warning and then took everything it wanted, as a tragedy to be mourned. She treated it as a new set of facts to be dealt with. Your eyes changed, she used to say. You didn't. Cara had believed her. She had learned to navigate by touch and sound and memory. She had finished school. She had enrolled in an early childhood education program at a community college in Dayton. She had built a life that was small but solid, and the foundation of that life, every single day, was Loretta. When Loretta's heart began to fail, slowly at first, then with a speed that gave them very little time, Cara stepped away from her program to be home. She told herself it was temporary. Loretta passed on a Sunday evening in late September. Cara had been holding her hand. The grief alone would have been enough to undo most people, but grief, for Cara, arrived with a second blow almost immediately. The house was rented. The savings Loretta had kept in a tin on the kitchen shelf covered 1 month, maybe slightly more if Cara was careful. There was no inheritance. There was no safety net. There was no one stepping forward to say, you don't have to figure this out alone. No one except her second cousin Dre, who called 3 days after the funeral. His voice had been warm. He had sounded certain. He told her there was space in his apartment in Columbus, that she should come, that it would be fine. Cara packed her bag and took the bus. What Dre had failed to mention was that he hadn't discussed this with his wife Sylvia before making the offer. Sylvia's feelings on the matter became clear within the first 24 hours, not through anything she said outright, but through the texture of daily life in that apartment, the silences at dinner that stretched too long, the way conversations paused whenever Cara entered a room and resumed when she left. The careful politeness that is somehow colder than open hostility, because at least open hostility gives you something to respond to. On the fourth morning, Cara was in the small room they'd given her when she heard them in the hallway. She wasn't trying to listen, but her hearing, sharpened by years of navigating a world she couldn't see, caught her own name through the wall clearly enough. She sat very still, and she listened to her cousin's wife explain, in a low and measured voice, that this wasn't something they'd agreed to, that the apartment wasn't big enough, that it wasn't fair to them, that Cara needed to find another arrangement. She heard Dre say, after a pause that lasted too long, "You're right, I'll talk to her." He knocked on her door an hour later. He used Sylvia's words, softened slightly. He said he was sorry. He said he wished things were different. He said he was sure she'd find something. Cara nodded. She thanked him, which she recognized, even as she was doing it, was a remarkable thing to do. She picked up her bag, she found the wall with her cane, she walked herself to the elevator, then the lobby, then through the front door and out into the cold. She stood on the sidewalk for a long moment. Then she started walking. She spent 2 nights in a shelter on the east side of Columbus. The staff were kind and the space was clean, but every unfamiliar environment was a puzzle she had to solve from scratch. The layout, the sounds, the way noise bounced off walls she couldn't see. She didn't sleep well. She sat on the cot at night and breathed slowly, and repeated the thing her grandmother used to say when everything felt too heavy. One thing at a time. On the 3rd night, the shelter was full. She was given a list of resources, a gentle apology, and a transit map she couldn't read. She found a bus. She thought it was heading toward the transit center. She got off at what she hoped was the right stop, found the nearest bench with her cane, and sat down. That bench was on Carver Street. When she finished, the diner had gone quiet around them. Aaron looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "You've been carrying all of that alone since September?" Cara looked down at her coffee. "My grandmother used to say that carrying something wasn't the same as being buried by it." Aaron was quiet. He was thinking about Renee, about the things he carried, about how some days the line between carrying something and being buried by it was thinner than anyone on the outside could see. "She sounds like she was remarkable," he said. Cara's jaw tightened for just a moment. "She was everything," she said softly. She was everything." The diner hummed quietly around them, plates clinking in the kitchen, the low murmur of other conversations. Outside the window, Carver Street was filling up with morning, people moving past, shoulders hunched against the cold, not stopping, not looking. Aaron watched them for a moment. Then he looked back at Cara, at her hands still wrapped around the mug, at the careful composure she'd been holding in place since the moment he met her, and the canvas bag on the seat beside her, packed like someone who had learned to carry everything they owned, because there was no guarantee of where they'd be tomorrow. He thought about the spare room, Renee's books, the row of clay pots on the windowsill. He thought about Nadia, who was in school right now, who had her mother's laugh and his stubbornness, and who sometimes, at night, still reached for a hand in the dark. He made a decision. He didn't weigh it for long. Some decisions don't need long. Sometimes you just know. "Cara," he said. She looked up, or rather, she turned toward his voice with that precise, focused attention that felt more present than most people managed with their eyes. "I have a spare room," he said. "It's sitting empty. I have a daughter. She's 7. Her name's Nadia. We're quiet people, and we keep a routine, but there's room, and you don't have to figure today out alone if you don't want to." The diner was quiet for a moment. Cara said nothing. Aaron waited, because he understood already that this was a woman who did not make fast decisions about trust. She had earned that caution the hard way. "You don't know me," she said finally. "I know enough," Aaron said simply. Another silence, longer this time. Then, very quietly, she said, "Why?" Aaron thought about it. He didn't rush the answer. "Because someone should have stopped sooner," he said. "And because I have the room. And because—" He paused. "Because my daughter would like you. I already know that." Cara was quiet for one more moment. Then she said, "Okay." Just that. "Okay." Aaron nodded. He lifted his hand and caught Pat's eye, asked for the check. Outside, Carver Street moved past the window, everyone going somewhere, everyone in a hurry, no one stopping. Inside, something had just begun. He walked her out of the diner with her bag on her shoulder and her cane in her hand. On the sidewalk, he said, "I'm going to call my daughter's after-school sitter. She can cover until we get back. Then we'll go get the room ready." Cara turned her face toward him. "You're doing this today?" "Yeah," he said. "Come with me." 3 words. She adjusted the strap of her bag, and she came. The spare room had been Renee's. It was where she kept her books, stacked in 2 careful columns on the small shelf by the window, the spines worn in a way that told you exactly which ones she had loved most. Her sewing things sat in a basket in the corner, threads still wound on the spools exactly as she'd left it. And on the windowsill there was a row of small clay pots she had made that last winter, the winter before everything changed, when she was still well enough to take the pottery class she'd been talking about since college. She'd made 7 of them, uneven, irregular, deeply personal. Aaron had kept them exactly where she'd placed them. He had not touched that room in 2 years. He told himself he was keeping it the way you keep something you'll deal with later, but later had never arrived, and he had quietly stopped pretending it would. The room had become a kind of monument, not to grief exactly, but to the particular stillness that grief leaves behind in the spaces where someone used to be. When he opened the front door of the apartment and stepped back to let Cara in, he felt the weight of that room from the hallway. She stood just inside the entrance, one hand lightly touching the doorframe, and did the thing she did in every new space, let the sounds of it arrange themselves into a shape she could carry. The hum of the refrigerator, the particular way the afternoon light came through and warmed the air near the window, the faint sound of the upstairs neighbor's television. She stood quietly and mapped it all. Aaron waited. "It's a good size," she said. "Yeah," he said. "It is." He walked her down the short hallway to the spare room and opened the door. He stood in the doorway for a moment, longer than he'd expected to. It was the first time in 2 years he'd opened it with the intention of changing it. The books, the basket, the clay pots on the sill. Renee. He breathed in slowly. Breathed out. "It's okay," he thought. "This is okay." He stepped inside. He worked steadily, moving the books to the hallway shelf with the careful attention of someone handling things that matter, carrying the sewing basket to the closet, keeping the clay pots to one side until they could find a place where they'd be safe and visible and not forgotten. He was halfway through when he heard the front door. He had forgotten he'd left it unlocked. Small footsteps, the sound of a backpack dropping in the hallway with a thud that was entirely too loud for someone 7 years old. Then, "Dad!" "In here, baby." The footsteps came down the hall. Nadia appeared in her school clothes, her braids slightly looser than they'd been that morning, her backpack abandoned somewhere behind her. She looked at the half-cleared room. She looked at Aaron. She looked at the woman sitting carefully on the edge of the bed, hands folded in her lap. Then she walked into the room and stood in front of Cara with the focused, evaluating attention of a child who takes new information very seriously. "I'm Nadia," she said. Cara turned toward her voice. "I'm Cara," she said. "Are you going to live with us?" "For a while," Cara said, "if that's okay with you." Nadia considered this. She looked at her father. She looked back at Cara. She seemed to be running through some internal checklist that Aaron was not entirely sure he'd pass either. Then she said with complete sincerity, "Are you scared of the dark? Because I used to be, and my dad sat with me every night until I wasn't anymore." Aaron felt something move through his chest, sharp and tender all at once, the specific sensation of being surprised by your own child in the best possible way. Cara was quiet for just a moment. "Maybe a little," she said softly. "Sometimes." Nadia reached out without hesitation and took her hand, with the complete, uncomplicated certainty of a child who has been shown enough times that kindness is simply the right response. "That's okay," she said. "You can get used to things." The first week was careful. That's the honest word for it. Not seamless, not magical, not easy, just Careful. The kind of careful that happens when real people who don't yet know each other are trying to share a space without getting it wrong. Cara learned the apartment the way she learned every new space, slowly, systematically, through touch and repetition. She walked each room's perimeter. She counted the steps between the bedroom door and the bathroom. She memorized where the furniture was, and she asked Aaron quietly one evening if anything was likely to move. He said no. He meant it. He never moved a single thing. For her part, Cara asked for very little. She made her own breakfast. She kept her room clean with a tidiness that spoke of someone who had learned, somewhere along the way, that being easy to accommodate was its own kind of safety. She said thank you for things that didn't require it. She never imposed. She never took up more space than she'd been offered. Aaron noticed this. He noticed it the way you notice something that tells you a great deal about a person's history, about what they'd learned to do to survive the spaces where they weren't fully wanted. He didn't say anything about it directly. He just started setting 2 mugs out every morning instead of 1. He started asking at dinner what she felt like eating instead of just cooking what was easy. Small signals, nothing dramatic, just a quiet, repeated message. There is room for you here. You don't have to earn it. The moments that accumulated were unremarkable on their own. Sunday mornings with too much food and not enough chairs, the 3 of them crowded around the kitchen table while Nadia narrated the weekend cartoons to Cara with the complete focused detail of a child who cannot imagine that anyone in the world would not want to know exactly what was happening on screen at every moment. Evenings on the couch, Nadia reading aloud from her school reader, stumbling over long words, stopping to ask Cara what they meant, and receiving explanations that were always exactly the right length, not too simple, not too complicated, just right, like someone who understood instinctively how to meet a child where they were. Tuesday afternoons, when the arithmetic homework became a full household event, and Cara sat at the kitchen table and explained fractions in a way that somehow, through some combination of patience and clarity and genuine interest in this particular stubborn 7-year-old's understanding of the world, finally made sense to Nadia in a way that nothing else ever had. Nadia announced, formally and with great conviction, that Cara was the best explainer in the entire world. Cara laughed, a real laugh, unguarded, surprised out of her. Aaron was standing at the stove when it happened, and he didn't turn around because he didn't want her to see his face at that exact moment. There were harder moments, too, because there always are. There was the morning Cara woke from a dream about Loretta and sat at the kitchen table at 4 a.m. in complete silence. Aaron found her there when he got up early and didn't know what to say, so he said nothing. He made coffee, set a mug in front of her, and sat down across from her in the dark. They didn't talk. They just sat there in the quiet of the early morning, each carrying something, neither pretending it wasn't heavy. After a long while, Cara said, "Thank you for sitting here." Aaron said, "Thank you for letting me." That was all. It was enough. There were evenings Aaron came home and found the apartment quiet and Nadia at the table doing homework alone and Cara not there, and felt a tightness in his chest that he didn't quite let himself examine. When Cara came home, always when she said she would, never late, he would say something easy like, "Good walk?" And she would tell him what she'd found. A park 2 blocks over, a path she liked, a coffee shop where the staff were kind, and he would let out a breath he hadn't quite realized he was holding and say something like, "I'll walk it with you sometime," and mean it. Cara re-enrolled in her early childhood education program by spring. She called the admissions office from the kitchen table on a Tuesday afternoon. When she hung up, she sat for a moment with her hands flat on the table and said, "They'll take my credits. I just have to finish 2 more classes." Aaron said, "That's really great, Cara." She nodded. Then, after a moment, "My grandmother would have liked knowing that." Aaron looked at her. "She would have been so proud," he said. Cara's face stayed still, but her hands pressed a little harder against the table for just a second. Then she picked up her phone and said she was going to email her advisor. He watched her navigate the phone entirely by touch, guided by the soft voice of her screen reader, and thought about Loretta, a woman he had never met, who had raised someone this quietly remarkable in a small rented house in Dayton, and had always known the exact right thing to say. "Your eyes changed. You didn't." He wished for just a moment he could have told her that she'd done something extraordinary. Aaron started sleeping better. Not immediately, not all at once, but somewhere around February, he noticed that he was waking up feeling rested in a way he hadn't been in 2 years. The apartment, without him doing anything specific to make it so, had become warmer. He still thought about Renee every single day. He still carried her in the yellow lunchbox, in certain songs, in the way the kitchen light fell on winter mornings. He had stopped believing that grief was something you finished. He believed it was something you learned to carry. And he had learned, slowly, that carrying something alongside someone else makes the weight feel different. Not lighter, different. And on the hardest days, different was enough. On a cold morning in February, Aaron passed the bus stop on Carver Street. It was a Tuesday. He was early. Nadia had been unusually cooperative that morning, dressed and ready with minutes to spare, which he had quietly counted as a small miracle. He walked the usual route, coffee in hand, the cold air clean and sharp the way February air sometimes is before it remembers it's supposed to be brutal. He reached Carver Street. He slowed. The bench was still there. The broken end still cracked, still patched with the same tape no one had ever replaced. The wood grayed from weather. The armrest on the left side still slightly loose. He stopped and looked at it. He thought about a young woman sitting there in the dark, before sunrise, in a jacket made for September. Sitting on the broken end she couldn't see was broken, her cane against her knee, her bag between her feet, her composure held so carefully in place that it had looked, from a distance, almost like fine. He thought about how long she had been there before he arrived. He thought about all the people who had walked past before he turned that corner. The early commuters, the dog walkers, the people already late, already looking at their phones, already thinking about the next thing and the thing after that. He thought about how close, how terrifyingly close he had come to being one of them. If he had left the apartment 3 minutes earlier, if he had taken the other route, if he had looked at his phone instead of looking up. But he hadn't. He turned onto Carver Street on 7:14 on a November morning and looked up from the sidewalk and seen her. And something inside him had gone very quiet, and he had stopped. And a 20-year-old woman who had lost her grandmother and her home and her sense of safety and her trust in the idea that anyone would genuinely choose to help her. That woman had been sitting on a broken bench in the cold, holding herself together with both hands. And one person had stopped. Just one. But one was enough. He thought about that morning at Marcy's diner. The way she'd looked down at the coffee mug when he asked what had happened to her. The way she'd said she was everything. And the whole weight of what that meant had filled the space between them without needing any more words. He thought about the 3 words he'd said on the sidewalk outside. Come with me. He thought about Nadia, right now at school, probably in the middle of something she'd narrate in extraordinary detail over dinner tonight. He thought about last Sunday morning. Too much food, not enough chairs, the kitchen warm and full in a way it hadn't been in 2 years. He thought about the clay pots on the hallway shelf, about the books, about the things we carry and the things we finally gently learn to set down, about how grief doesn't end, it just changes, becomes something you live around rather than through, and how the only thing that makes that possible is the presence of other people who are doing the same in the rooms around you. He stood at that bench for a moment longer. Then he looked up, took a slow breath of February air, cold and clean and sharp, and he kept walking. He was grateful in a way that lived too deep for ordinary words, not for luck, not for timing. Grateful that he had looked up from the sidewalk. Grateful that the jacket had been too thin because it was the thing that made him stop. Grateful for the broken bench she couldn't see because it was the thing that made him stay. Grateful for a diner 2 blocks north and a waitress named Pat who brought 2 plates without being asked. Grateful for 3 words spoken on a sidewalk. Come with me. And for a young woman who had every reason not to trust a stranger, who had been let down by every person she'd reached toward, who adjusted the strap of her bag and came anyway. And grateful every single day, in a way that never faded, for a 7-year-old girl who had stood in a hallway and taken a stranger's hand and said, with the complete certainty of a child who has been loved well, "That's okay. You can get used to things." He kept walking. The bench on Carver Street grew smaller behind him, and ahead, warm and real and waiting, was home. If this story reached something in you, if it reminded you that it's never too late to stop and never too late to forgive, please share it with someone who needs it today. Subscribe to Everhart Tales for more stories like this one, and drop a comment.